Good morning, everyone. This is Jim Harper from the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems, and I want to welcome you to our third and final webinar in this series of three. It seems that everyone can hear us, and I hope that you can also see the screen very clearly. This is the webinar about integrating gender and nutrition into the reporting and framing of international livestock research projects. So you were in the right place. You're watching the right broadcast. This is, however, the final of three webinars, and I just want to remind you, if you go to our website, if you look, and if you Google Livestock Lab as one word, you'll find it easily. We have the other two webinars stored there. The first webinar was held on May 30th about the integration of gender and nutrition into the design of livestock research projects. And then 2 weeks later, on June 13th, we talked about data collection and analysis of livestock research projects. And now today we're bringing all three of those together and talking about the final reporting of livestock research projects. So if your friends are not able to tune in live today, please let them know that they can go to our website to find this material archived and watch this broadcast. But we do welcome all of you who are here live today, and hope that you will enjoy and appreciate this webinar as much as we've enjoyed putting it together for you. We've really learned a lot, and I think that we are also exploring some new ground. And so I'd like us to go ahead and get started. I'll just mention for people who are watching on Facebook that we welcome you as well. Those of you who are watching on Zoom, you are able to ask questions. You can use the Q&A option or the chat room, which we will be monitoring throughout this talk, but most likely all questions will be answered towards the end of this presentation because we do have some important material we want to get through. And lastly, I just want to ask for your full attention. Please turn off your cell phones, turn off every distraction that's around you, and focus in on today's topic. And with that, I'm now going to turn it over to our two co-hosts.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. For those of you who may not have attended the first two previous webinars, I'm Kathy Colverson, the Senior Gender Scientist associated with the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab. And I'm going to do a very quick review of what we covered in our first two webinars. As Jim mentioned, the first one is associated with how do we do project design. And project design basically involves us taking a look at not only what the previous research is that exists around the topic that we are considering, but also helping us ultimately to arrive at our research question. And this is basically involving taking a look at not only existing research, but also beginning to plan how you're going to collect your baseline data. And essentially, it's sort of a summary associated with the first webinar was that if we're looking at, for example, using integrating gender and nutrition into a project where we might be increasing the amount of milk production in a rural country in Africa, some of the areas that we could look at specifically associated with integrating gender would be looking at what are the gender roles associated with the milk production. We can also, when we begin to look at nutrition, identify who makes some of the decisions around whether milk is consumed or sold from the production that has been increased. And if we look at some of the data associated with the existing research, we can look to see have there been any previous gender analyses done in that research area associated with dairy production. And ultimately, when we begin to look at planning and collection for our baseline data, we need to think about what are some of those gaps that we've discovered in the existing research to help us inform our final research question. In webinar number 2, we looked at data collection and analysis, and there were a variety of areas that we focused on in webinar number 2, specifically associated with looking at what types of gender and nutrition data do we collect and analyze, how do we look at the tools that have already been created, do we need to adapt or adopt what's there, and then we ultimately are going to be collecting the data. So the summary from webinar number 2 was basically look at whether or not you want to collect quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, and we gave a number of examples associated with that. We said to consider the tools that you're going to be using, and one of the examples that we gave is one that USAID is very happy with and very much promoting these days, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. There's a great deal of information on that, particularly associated with our resource pages. And if we look at some of the questions that may needed to be involved in our data collection, we could ask, for example, again, going back to our example of increased dairy production in a rural African country, We could say if women earned more income from dairy production, what actually happens with that income? Who makes that decision? So essentially, those were the kind of highlights from our first two webinars. And we're now going to move into our third webinar of the series, as Jim mentioned, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah McKune. I am the cross-cutting theme leader for health and human nutrition here at the Livestock Innovation Lab. And today, what we really want to talk about is framing and reporting. So if we think about a project cycle, and these three webinars have been built around this concept that you've got somewhat arbitrary because it is a cycle, and it is, we'll come back to this at the end, but it's an iterative process. But there is a cycle of design, implementation, and reporting or learning, you might say. And so we've tried to break these webinars up into those different phases of project implementation or research implementation. So today we're really honing in on this framing and reporting. And candidly, this was the genesis for some of the ideas in developing the webinar, because so many of our projects within the Livestock System Innovation Lab are not traditional gender projects. They're not traditional nutrition projects, but that doesn't mean that they don't have findings that are relevant, that push the needle towards improving the nutritional outcomes of kids. So this is the crux of the messages that we really wanted to get out. So if you look at what we have and we think about projects and research, not just within the Livestock System Innovation Lab, but more broadly within the livestock sector, what do we mean when we say framing and reporting? What we really mean is that there is this objective that we link the research and the work that we're doing to nutritional outcomes. And we know that gender is essential for doing that well. So all project types, all of these Livestock System Innovation Lab efforts need to think about how did gender and nutrition, how did that along the way sort of retrospectively impact our project? And so we need to put that lens on and look at what has happened and how did that change our outcomes. But at the same time, we want to take the data that we do have from these projects and frame it and put it into something, a packaging that makes it relevant for stakeholders moving forward for gender, women's empowerment, nutritional outputs, and ultimately impact. So that's what we're talking about today. So this question, what do we mean by framing and reporting? Well, we know that projects have had various engagements along this, what we call an integration continuum. So we think about projects that are gender nutrition blind, all the way down to what we coined as these gender nutrition transformative projects. But based on where people are on that spectrum, you're going to have at design, implementation, and analysis, you're going to know that there are mechanisms that gender and nutrition, let's say, there are mechanisms by which those are operationalized, and there are outcomes. But all of that's going to depend upon what questions were asked and where you fell along that continuum. So if we look moving forward, if you go to the next slide for me, the framing and reporting for gender and nutrition is relevant for almost all of the livestock systems research projects, because all of you have data. And that's really what we're trying to get at today, is all of you have data that are relevant to nutrition stakeholders, and they can inform, even if it hasn't been taken into consideration retrospectively, it can inform the gender dynamics and understandings of the system as we move forward. Kathy?
Okay, very good. One of the things that I want to talk about for just a minute, and this is partly because I'm a little obsessive about audiences and what we create, is to think very carefully about who are your final audiences and what are the products that you're producing when you are not only doing your framing and reporting, but actually in any kind of work that we do associated with the livestock system. So we need to think about the fact that we are going to have numerous different types of audience. It could be farmer groups, it could be university faculty, it could be government officials. So ultimately, or actually even our donors in many cases. But we have to think very carefully about what and who are the audiences that we are producing products for, and what kind of variety of products are available or should we be considering. So we have created a little table here that's mainly associated with our Livestock Systems Innovation Lab communications document to look at who are potential audiences associated with the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab. And actually you could be using this table very much for a variety of different products that you're going to be producing. But looking at donors and what kinds of things donors are interested in, looking at producers and consumers, what they might be interested in, policymakers, academic communities, NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see that the products are going to differ a little bit based on who the audience or the target individual is. And so it's very important to consider this when we're doing our final report.
Yeah, and can I just jump in, because I think at the heart of this is this idea that the same data that you've collected, whether you see yourself as an agronomist or a fodder expert, or you ran a feed trial or whatever, can be packaged and should be packaged quite differently based on who your target audience is, and that same information needs to go to multiple stakeholders.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have some examples that we want to give. If we move forward and go and kind of return to, as Sarah mentioned, the gender nutrition integration continuum that we have somewhat co-opted from a variety of different friends of mine. We look at the bottom of the basically continuum, where we looked at considerations around gender blind and nutrition blind and what we mean by that. We actually talked about that quite a bit in the previous webinar, but if we look at what is gender blind or what is nutrition blind, we basically say to ourselves that we didn't really consider gender in the project design or data collection. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the webinar, because of the fact that there may be instances when you think you're gender blind, but you actually have collected indirect material or information that may help to inform. So it's important to think about, when you're analyzing and reporting the project results, you can still reflect on whether or not gender had any influence on your project outcomes, or basically can inform what you're going to be doing moving forward. And if we think about, for example, a gender blind example, we have examples in the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab where we have people doing a great deal of capacity development around, mainly usually around livestock, some aspect. So the example we have here, thanks to Lacey, our very apt, great, she does a lot of graphics for us, thank you, is an example associated with animal feeds training. We have somebody that has decided they want to do a training on basically proper feeding of animals. And who shows up at the training? Well, predominantly males. We may have one or two women that show up. And so the first question that should come into your mind is, why? Why don't we have equal numbers of men or women showing up at this training? So our adoption rate ultimately of this materials or information associated with this training may be low. And we need to ask the next question then is, why? Why is this the case? Despite being gender blind, can we still use a gender lens to interpret what we're seeing if we've collected information on basically, let's just say, sex disaggregated data? Or who attended the training? We can say, how many women do we have? How many men? Why didn't we have equal numbers? So this is something that could be considered. But then if we actually backtrack a little bit, we say, okay, but who actually, in this particular example of feeding, let's just say dairy cows or beef cattle or small ruminants, who actually does the feeding? Have we done a gendered analysis to determine, is it the adult male, the adult female, the female children, the male children? Who actually does the feeding associated with this particular animal or livestock? So if we move ahead and we think about, okay, oh my goodness, we actually say, actually women are responsible for doing the majority of not only feeding the animal, but harvesting the forages or providing the water or taking the animal out to pasture, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to start thinking about, as we target the audience, as we target who is it that needs to be present at the training, we consider from a gender perspective who actually is doing the work. And if we do consider this, will it actually have an influence on our adoption rate? And we are proposing, of course, that it would. That if women are predominantly responsible for doing the feeding and they are not at the training, then they're not going to get the information. And there's a lot of data to indicate that's the case. So what are the potential implications of targeting women for the trainings on our final adoption rate? Well, in theory, it should increase.
Right, but I think what's essential to bear in mind here is we're talking about a project that's done, right? A project ran this training and missed the mark. They didn't recruit the right people. So the point is, you've got the lower adoption rate. But in hindsight, you recognize that there was this gap. That can go into the discussion or use of the data that you do have. You know that you only had 25% women, and it should have been 75% if it was going to reflect the reality. So with that additional information, it allows you with a gendered lens to interpret the data you have. You don't change your adoption rate this round, but what you do is you interpret that adoption rate with the gendered lens.
And it informs future research and also the recommendations that you could write up actually in your final report.
Yeah.
So if we continue kind of moving down the continuum, I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Yeah, great, Kathy. So Kathy walked us through a gender blind example, obviously within the context of a potentially nutrition pathway of impacting nutrition at the end of it. I'm going to take a more traditional nutrition project in this middle ground. So we talk about nutrition sensitive or specific projects. And I want to go back to, next slide, I want to go back to this diagram that we put out, I think in the first, or at minimum the second webinar, to really look at the integration of what you see in top. There's a simplification of the UNICEF model of nutrition, sort of how do you get through intermediate and underlying causes of nutrition to the ultimate goal. And what you have here is the integration of those three well-established pathways that come out of agriculture, equally out of livestock, to affect the nutrition. So I've tried to connect those with these lines of both benefits and risk. But you see production, income, and women's empowerment. Again, those three major pathways for affecting the end goal. Well, if we take that, we know that nutrition is the goal, right? That is the ultimate goal for these projects. But we know that, next slide, the investment of the Livestock System Innovation Lab and a lot of livestock systems research and projects is in those pathways, right? Your goal, you may not be aiming for a nutritional impact, right? That may be the spirit of the project. The funder may want you to do that ultimately, but when you look at your independent and dependent variables, you may exist in those bottom three arrows entirely, where you're looking at a trial to improve weight gain of cattle, or you're trying to, and there's an assumption then that that's going to connect to nutrition. So that's the framework that we're working in. Next slide. So I'm going to a public health model where we talk a lot about upstream and downstream effects. And so if we think of ultimately what we want as nutrition, as an outcome, that's downstream. And all of those investments and inputs into the system, lowercase I inputs, are upstream.
Exactly.
So let's think about how does this translate into these livestock projects? Next slide. Inputs are upstream, right? It might be genetics, it might be feed, it might even be looking at aflatoxin in feed, right? All of those food safety upstream projects have the aim of improving productivity or production
Could be extension
of animals. Exactly, it might be education. Then you get into that ASF production realm where you may actually be measuring, did we change milk offtake? Did we change cattle productivity on a certain hectare of land or whatnot? And then finally, the idea is that those are going to feed into nutrition. And we do have a few within the lab, and there are some livestock projects, but by and large, livestock projects fail to collect nutritional data. Even if they're funded and developed in the spirit of improving human nutrition, as a global community, we haven't done a great job of collecting the data on human nutrition within those projects. Some have, but most have not. So the question is, if my project is not nutrition sensitive, but it's fairly upstream, like water production, feed contamination, there are lots of examples. How do I take my data and make it meaningful, not just to my donor, not just to USAID, Feed the Future, but all over? There are lots of examples. But how do I report it in a way that is usable? How do I produce an output that can be used by the people who are working to improve human nutrition?
and think about audience.
That's right.
Yep.
So the first answer is, of course, it depends upon your data. So you have to go back, which is why that design phase is so important, and say, what data did I collect?
Iterative.
Exactly. So if we look at each of these three levels, we can see, next slide, that there are data that get collected, right? And we gave these examples in the last webinar, but these are examples. These are not prescriptive. But if we think about what's been collected, most likely, we've grayed out that box at the bottom. Many of you in livestock research are not collecting nutritional data. And so I really want to speak to those of you in the audience to say, use the data you have, right? And so use the data you have and frame it in a way that's meaningful. And those of us that are in human health can pick it up and take it in stride. So that will allow the feedback loop to complete back to, you can infer, you can use those pathways to say, I improved weight gain of cattle. I'm now producing the same amount of milk with 8 cattle instead of 20. There are metrics that come out of traditional livestock research that are meaningful if you put them within the framework of human nutrition.
Very similar to gender. Exactly. So if we move on and we get to the end game associated with our gender nutrition continuum, we go back to this concept of gender and nutrition transformative, which is really where a lot of cutting edge research is right now, associated particularly in the gender community. So if we think about what do we mean when we talk about gender and nutrition transformative projects? Well, unlike gender blind studies, or to some extent even gender accommodating, transformative projects are proactive. They think about these gender nutrition questions from the very beginning, and they select approaches and questions specifically associated with the project design phase that will inform them as they move forward to begin to address some of the underlying structures and issues associated with gender and nutrition in particular, even if we are talking about something that we don't consider to be a gender and or nutrition project. And we mentioned previously that it's possible to use tools like the gender analysis associated with the Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index. There's a great deal of information on the WIA, as we call it, and it's an excellent tool, a little time consuming, but it's an excellent tool. So we really encourage people to take a look at that. There also, when we think about looking at things associated with nutrition, you can be doing collection of dietary diversity, 24-hour recall, child growth, et cetera, et cetera. So there are things that we think about when we look at transformative projects that inform the types of data that we're collecting and the types of tools that we're going to be using.
Can I jump in there? I think that the really important part about that top bullet at a macro level is that as we move down this integration continuum, there is this whole conversation about what can I do at this level if my project was gender blind? What can I do in the middle if I have gender sensitive, but I haven't necessarily plugged it in? And now we're talking the transformative. And I think the point that, as you and I sort of brainstormed and put this together, is there is an assumption if you're going to be transformative that you've done the work.
Absolutely.
You've done the work to make sure you've collected some of the data. Because if you don't have it, it's about framing. But if you have it, then you use it.
You use it, exactly. And just to do a quick reiteration, the thing that is really unique and also exciting and very challenging about transformative projects, be it gender or nutrition, is that they explicitly look at underlying structures and issues.
That's right.
And they challenge them. And so it's important to consider that if we think about what kind of data do you need to collect, well, information on intra-household power dynamics is critical. I used to do work in Bangladesh, and one of the most interesting things that we discovered is that the mother-in-law has tremendous power within the household to determine not only nutrition, but how income is spent, et cetera, which is fascinating. And then if we also begin to look at underlying policies, resources, infrastructure within institutions that affect gender or nutrition, and then try to affect those in our research, that becomes then a transformative project. Okay, and I have an example that I just wanted to pull up to think a little bit about. Sometimes I'll have people say to me, well, we want to engage more women in our farm cooperatives. We want them to take greater leadership roles. And it may be that they actually institute a policy associated with affirmative action where they say, okay, 50% of the members have to be women, and at least 3 of them have to be in leadership positions. And so that may be true. On the surface, you may see that, or you may see, as I say, increased access to credit and loans. But the underlying questions then that should be asked is, even though we may have women in leadership positions, or even though we may have women having greater access to credit and loans, does it really benefit them in the end, or is it benefiting someone else? And in many instances, we are seeing women being put into these positions or having access to credit and loans that ultimately are used by the male members of the family.
Well, and I think we would be remiss not to, at this point, talk about time poverty, because so many innovations that come in to be gender sensitive and gender aware, and particularly within the nutrition realm, historically have just added to it's additional work that go onto women's plates. So some of those tools we talked about early on, about like a daily schedule, having a gender daily schedule, having stakeholders create those, allow you to see that these so-called interventions that are supposed to be alleviating stress or improving food security for women, in fact, they may change an outcome that you're looking at for the better. But if you don't look at these underlying dynamics at play, they can have real detrimental effects on certain systems pieces, even if even at the same time simultaneously improving certain outcomes.
Absolutely. And we could go on and on about that, but I know we're going to be limited for time. So we're going to just kind of go back and do a little quick recap of what we've covered so far.
So I think, again, what we wanted to do was respond to these questions and concerns that I hear a lot, but I'm not a gender expert. I don't have a gender project. Or similarly, it's not really a nutrition project. I mean, I know I'm funded by USAID, Feed the Future, but I don't even know, how do I make this a nutrition project? So I want to go back to this diagram that says there is a relationship between the investment that happens in livestock programming and the ways that it affects nutrition, those three pathways, right? So we think about food production or income generation or women's empowerment, and arguably women's empowerment can be overlaid on those two things, right? But we can measure outcomes, right? I go back to research in public health. We talk a lot about exposure and outcome, but it's the same thing as independent and dependent variables. All of your variables may exist within that tier of those green arrows that look like livestock work, right? And many of you may be encompassed entirely in that production space. But that doesn't mean that you can't take a study that has whatever your metric is, right? I have identified the best feed composition for these locally available chickens. That's my research. When you go to publish that, we can actually talk about impact, right? So we're no longer, you may not have measured impact, but you can frame those data within the UNICEF framework for nutrition and say household food security is requisite. You have to have household food security sufficient before you get dietary intake, which is going to be the immediate determinant of nutrition. If you frame a set of data around feed composition for chickens in wherever in the world in a way that is nutrition informed, you can make that data really relevant to broader impact.
And let me just jump in real quick, because I'm thinking about Sarah's slide associated with upstream and downstream. We talked about that a great deal before we used that in the webinar this week. But to think about ultimately impact, you have to look at the system. Again, you have to go back and say, who ultimately is being impacted by the research that I'm doing? I used to do a lot of work with research scientists that particularly would say, well, my research, I'm creating vaccines, and that doesn't have anything to do with gender. And I'd say, well, it certainly does. I said, who's going to be administering the vaccines? How are they going to be able to access them? Can they afford them? Start thinking about the larger system, about who ultimately is going to be the recipient of the product that you may be producing or the impact of the research that you're going to have. And you will find, quite frankly, that there's a gender lens on just about everything that we do. And very closely, nutrition follows. So basically, if we do a little quick review of what we've been talking about this morning, and we think about some of the steps that we could use to appropriately frame and then ultimately report on the work that we've been doing, we hope we've convinced you at this point that regardless of where you're at on the gender nutrition continuum, and regardless of whether or not you think that your project either has a gender focus or a nutrition focus, there are ways that you can actually capture the data that you have collected and begin to frame it in a different way. So one of the first things we think about is you can ask yourself the question, if we go back to the gender and nutrition continuum, where does your project fall? Are you gender blind? Are you nutrition blind? Are you nutrition sensitive? Are you gender accommodating? Are you thinking down the full spectrum of the continuum to being gender and nutrition transformative? So those are some of the first questions that you might want to ask yourself as you, number one, create a project, but also if you're already analyzing the data that you've collected on your current project. And then the question you ask yourself, what data did you collect that might inform ultimately nutrition or gender outcomes? And very many times people will say, well, I have sex disaggregated data. Now what do I do with it? And that's about how do we analyze the data that you've collected? How do we look at how many women were there? How many men were there? What kinds of activities were you engaged in that would have produced equal numbers of men and women or far fewer of one or the other sex? So it's important to not only take that data and have that information, but then to begin to analyze it.
Can I probe that? Because I think that the sex disaggregated data, I would argue that many projects fall actually between gender nutrition blind and that middle ground, because they actually have sex disaggregated data because a donor has required it or for whatever reason. But other than that, they're gender blind.
Exactly.
And so it's a question of what do I do with it? And what I love about the example that you gave in this webinar, Kathy, is that it's a gender blind training, right? But it isn't simply about 50-50 women and men showing up at the training. And I think often when we talk about sex disaggregated data, people think we're looking for equity. And the driver and the onus behind collecting sex disaggregated data is actually interpretation.
Exactly.
It's interpretation. Like I said, what I love about the example you gave was you looked at that uptake rate. And it wasn't about, oh, we only got 25% women and we should have gotten 50-50. No, if the target of that training and the behavior modification that we're aiming for is actually done predominantly by women, then we need to have predominantly women in the training. Now, I'll say importantly, you may need a parallel training, depending upon where you work in the world, to get men on board. Because in a lot of places where I work, if men aren't on board, even if women make 100% of the decision, there can be a blockage, right? So you have to understand that context. But it isn't simply about equity, right? Equity is not, and we can get into equality and equity, but it's something different than that. It's using it for interpretation.
I always say to students that I'm working with, so you've got the information, so what, number one, and then why? I always ask the question, why? If we keep digging deeper and deeper and we keep trying to push the edge of the envelope further and further down the continuum, you keep asking that question. And as I say, the data that we've collected could be, as I say, associated with animal source food consumption, could be associated with increasing income, could be associated with, again, thinking about transformative projects, gender decision making. How does that data impact our final review and reporting of what we're trying to do? And then ultimately, how do you report this to reflect upon, inform, or affect future gender and nutrition outcomes? And again, I'll go back to the conversation around who is your ultimate audience. If basically your data is going to be going back out to farmer groups, we need to think about issues associated with literacy, access to the materials, multiple different venues associated with how do we present that data. And then what kind of deliverable is audience appropriate? Is it going to be a full-fledged 30-page, peer-reviewed journal publication, or is it going to be
Nobody's going to read it.
Nobody will read it, by the way. Yes, there's a lot of data on that. But or a 3-page brief that has a lot of photos that actually demonstrate what we learned and how can it be applied. So it's important to consider that. And can the same information be packaged for multiple stakeholders? So it's important to think about that.
The other piece that I don't think we've reinforced since the beginning is that there is a bidirectional space for potential. We've talked mostly about taking the data that you have and framing it and reporting, but it's really important to take the retrospective look as well. And that's the reflect, inform, and affect, right? So it's from a temporal standpoint, it's all of those. Take your study and look at it and say, how can we interpret our results differently with a gendered lens, with the nutrition lens, but equally, how can we take the data and push the conversation forward, the research forward?
Exactly, and we're always about that. So going a little final review.
That is the end of the content here for the third webinar, but we wanted to take just a minute to put all of those pieces together in this project research cycle, which we get is an oversimplification, but it's at minimum a metaphor with some concrete snippets of information and trying to help you position yourself along it, but also see where you can move forward. I'm not going to read through this. We wanted to have it all captured on the slide. Kathy walked through most of it from the beginning, but the idea is that at the design phase, at data collection and analysis, and in the reporting phase, there are consistently opportunities to improve the way gender and nutrition are integrated into these livestock projects. And it is a cycle. And at any step along the cycle, you might have to spin off and do a little microcycle of this, a little bit of research that informs, collects, learns to come back in to better do the broader research question that you have at hand. And that might happen at design phase. We talked about that. It might happen between data collection and reporting. You might look back on what you did and think, whoa, were those the right people?
Right
I'm going to
questions.
go to the field and do a little qualitative research to say, should that have really been older men? No, actually, it should have been younger men.
Mhm.
Should have been younger men and girls
Mhm.
that whatever it is that you're putting together. And that information provides you the ability to interpret
Mhm.
the data that you have coming in. So it could happen at any point in the cycle that you step aside,
Mhm.
reevaluate, get a little bit more information, and look back at what you've done or what you are going to do
Mhm.
with a more informed gender nutrition lens.
Absolutely. All research should ultimately be iterative.
So that wraps it up for us. Jim, are you going to man some questions for us here?
Yeah. See if we've got any.
Yes, so I want to open it up for questions. Actually, I'm going to come around and step onto the camera with you just to say hello to our audience.
Please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Harper, and I just want to say congratulations to our two panelists, Dr. McKune and Dr. Colverson, for creating our first webinar series. So this is the first time we've done this. We hope you really enjoyed it. We hope to do more of these as well in the future. So that's the first thing I want to say is congratulations, and I think you've done a really great job and set the bar very high. We are planning to do more in the coming months, so look forward to that. But at this point, we want to take some questions. Let me step away from the camera and ask people to type in the chat room or the Q&A box to present their questions, but I will go ahead and ask the first one. And that question is, why did we do this webinar series? Why is it important? Haven't we addressed gender issues enough? And aren't we solving the nutrition? Okay, they're looking at me
Would you like my really?
I'm a fool.
We've never addressed gender and nutrition enough is my response to everybody. I think partly what was the impetus and the initiative behind doing this is that certainly at the beginning of the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, I received numerous requests and questions from people who not only were sub-award recipients, but also from other research scientists that said, okay, I sort of understand it's important. Help me figure out how can I create a project that actually integrates gender and then actually captures the data that we need to have to be able to have an impact on the final audience, which we do recognize now actually might be women. And so that was one of the, basically I say the impetus for, at least from my perspective, to get this started. But we've had a lot of requests to really think about this from a project planning cycle, as well as can you give us specific resources that are available that might also help to inform our research and help us in the final analysis and write-up of our reports.
Yeah, and I think trying to meet the needs of the PIs for the Innovation Lab, so those researchers funded by the lab who have obvious, like selected peer-reviewed expertise in their field. But I mean, one of the real luxuries I think that Kathy and I both have is that we have a foot in development and a foot in academia. And those are really, they're two really different worlds.
Oh, yes.
And because of our various backgrounds, we sort of straddle those two worlds. But and in development, people know that these things are integrated and they have to be. And that's been clear. It's clear by donor mandate, it's clear by best practices. But in the academic space, things are a lot more siloed, and you are trained, and the rewards are there to be an expert in your field. And to take researchers and put them into a research for development space is a challenge. I mean, it speaks to that, the question always when you apply for federal money, what's the broader impact, right? And that's a challenge, I think, for researchers, traditional academic researchers, to bridge over into that space. So I think that's the challenge that we face.
So we do have our first question, and it's from Emily Uma, who's one of our principal investigators in one of our research projects. And she actually said over here in the chat room that she's here together with Irene Mutambo in Uganda. So we want to welcome all of our guests from Uganda and all around the world. Her question, first she says thank you to Kathy and Sarah for putting this together. They are on a first name basis. Could you please share some of the tools that address gender decision-making questions? We realize that it's not quite straightforward as it seems.
Absolutely. Emily, I will be happy to send you a variety of different tools and references that would assist with that. And indeed, it is never straightforward. But we will do the best to actually assemble some tools that would be useful. And we'll actually make sure that if they're not already listed on our resources page, that we will put them up on the website as well.
Do you want to speak a little bit about where those come from?
Well, WIA has some excellent aspects associated with gender decision making. I like to use things associated that are a little bit more simple, a little bit less time intensive. 24-hour clocks are great. When we look at seasonal calendars and to determine who does what at different times of the season, we have value chain tools that specifically look at different kinds of either livestock or vegetable value chains that also are lined up to decide who makes decisions at various stages. We have tools associated with the Ingenious project that I was on for the past 4 years, which are associated with gender decision making. And I think we listed that in some of the previous resources and the previous webinars. But there are a number of different tools at various different levels of intensity that we can provide.
Yeah, and I think importantly, they are from a method standpoint, they're qualitative and quantitative tools. So there are survey questions that you can put in to ask about decision making around certain practices, right? So particularly in livestock, it may be about ownership. It may be about, sure, women own the animals, but when sold, who makes decisions about where that money goes? So the granularity with which these instruments can go is infinite.
Yes.
I mean, it can just keep going. But there are also macro level tools that are more like focus group, thematic questions. And I've tended to use a lot of those to say, talk to me about decision making within a household. And particularly when you're talking to women, you can start by saying, what decisions do you make?
Yes.
You know, so I think there's so many tiered layers, Emily, with which you can approach this. That we'll make sure you have the resources available, but I think the door is open, and to think about what's meaningful to your work. Is it a quantitative metric or is it a more qualitative description of what's going on?
And one other thing to consider when you are collecting data of that type is that you may need to do sex segregated groups first, because women are frequently not going to be comfortable speaking in front of either their husbands. They won't tell you what they really think, or they certainly won't be comfortable speaking in public if it's a mixed sex group.
And you may need age disaggregated as well, because younger women often see things differently than older women.
Indeed, absolutely. All right, we've got some more.
We've got a few more questions, but first, could I ask you to talk about these resources here, and especially the final two ones here, which are two publications by some pretty important people.
I don't know about that.
Who wrote these?
Well, the one on increasing the health and nutritional outcomes of the government of Rwanda's One Cow Per Board Family Program was a paper that I wrote actually a while ago, but it finally got through the journal publication, and it is now published. And I'm very thankful, and hopefully that will inform some of Emily's work in particular. And then the second one was actually one that was recently done through one of our sub-awardees in the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, which was very exciting. So we are getting some papers out there.
That was I think the last one is from a student of mine, and it was done in Nepal.
Oh, excellent.
Okay, so we have Shailendra Kumar asking a couple questions. It has been good learning, and and you gave a general framework, but gender challenges are most often context and community specific.
Absolutely.
So let's address that. And a second question mentions that cultural norms are many times big barriers to empowerment and nutrition.
Absolutely.
How effectively can we capture and at what level?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I guess I operate from a space where that's absolutely implicit, and perhaps we should have made it explicit, that all of this has to be locally contextualized. And as we were preparing for this webinar, we actually talked about, and I said, don't let me forget, and I forgot, that, you know, as a social scientist, a lot of the work that happens around nutrition is about behavior change. It's psychology. It's about stigma and cultural norms and taboos. And one of the things that struck me in putting this together and trying to switch my lens and think more like an animal scientist or someone who's more in the agricultural sector is that as a social scientist, I can no more assume that production is going to happen and that there will be availability of food, and that all I have to do is get over those cultural norms and barriers for behavior change, and that will be sufficient. I can no more do that than you, as agricultural experts in your fields of agronomy or animal scientists or whatever it is that you bring to the table, then you can assume that increasing production and productivity is sufficient without the cultural piece. So it really is an interdisciplinary effort, and there are a lot of others. There are people who work on markets and policy and transportation, and all of us have to be at the table, right?
Exactly.
But I think that we were remiss not to talk about the significance of that very, very sort of last level of barriers. Everything may be in place. The recipe has been followed, but at the end, if it's not relevant for people on the ground and it's not responsive to their reality, you don't get anywhere. So it's a really important point.
And I think Sarah hit on a couple of really key points. In the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, we have a number of what are called areas of inquiry. And a lot of them are very technical. We have production, we have diseases, we have food safety, but we also have cutting across everything, the cross-cutting themes of gender, nutrition, and human capacity development. And these affect every single one of those. And we have very strong interdisciplinary teams that we create, especially for that reason, to everybody listen to each other and inform everyone so that we have the best chances of ultimate success within the context we are working within. And I totally agree with Sarah. It's implicit. If you've ever done any serious work in development, you realize you have to understand the context.
Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Yes.
All right, we have another question here, and we do have about 5 more minutes for questions. So this one comes from Jessica McCurry, and she says, "Thank you, ladies, for this webinar. It's been really helpful and insightful. Will there be other events that you'll be holding in the future, other workshops or conferences?"
Yes. Well, we're actually going to take this information from these 3 webinars and repackage it. We're talking about repackaging in this webinar into potentially some training materials and some training opportunities. I'm planning to do a training in East Africa, possibly Rwanda in the fall. The gender team is actually scheduling one in each of the different regions that the Livestock Innovation Lab works at different times during the remainder of the period of time that the Livestock Innovation Lab is funded. And I don't know if you have any specific things.
No, not in that way. We targeted the use of webinars rather than face-to-face trainings. But again, there is a difference between the nutrition and the gender piece. And I think that one of the most important aspects of what Kathy alluded to is that we do have a human institutional capacity development team here at UF. And we've been talking about working with them to take these webinars and to create training materials so that it's you on the ground with the local context and expertise that can adapt this training to your needs and inform your partners and stakeholders there. But I think if I can interpret the question slightly differently, will there be other webinars, or will there be other content? I mean, Kathy and I work together a lot. We have fun doing this together, and I think we're open to that. This was the product and the response to needs that came to the lab. So I think if there are other needs that, with our combined expertise and integrating the gender and nutrition components, that we could respond to, please, we're open to those. You can email the lab. The address is in front of you. Please contact us, because we would like to hear what those needs are. But again, this was responsive to a set that we heard of early on.
All right, so before we finish things up, I'm going to turn the camera around on myself. We have a special surprise coming up in just a moment. So please stay tuned. You won't want to miss this. This has never happened before. We are live on Facebook. So this is also going out internationally around the Facebook world. But before we go, I also want to remind you that this webinar and this series of 3 webinars has been brought to you by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. And here you see our contact information on the screen. Our website, please go there to learn more about us and also to find the archive of these webinars. We have the first 2 already there, and the 3rd one will be added shortly. That address is livestocklab.ifas.ufl.edu. We are based at the University of Florida that hosts that website. You can also email us at livestock-lab@ufl.edu. And please check us out also on Facebook. Some of you are watching us live right now, but go to our Facebook page. You can put comments there, or our Twitter feed at livestock_lab. And we also have our mailing address in case you want to know where we are physically here in Gainesville, Florida. So this brings us to the conclusion of our 3 webinars. And I want to thank everyone for their attention and for your questions. They've been very insightful. Let me just make sure we don't have any other questions here on our, it looks like we don't here on the screen. So we've answered those Q&A questions, and in the chat room, it looks like we're done. You still have a minute or two to ask a question, so if you have a final one, try to type it in and send it to us, or connect with us through our website or email. This has been the 3 webinars about the integration of gender and nutrition into livestock research projects, and we hope that you will share this information with your friends. And there are 2 friends I'd like to introduce to you right now, so I'm going to turn the camera around and allow them to say farewell to you.
We would like to thank you again for attending this expert webinar series, and we would like to extend a warm welcome to come visit us.
Ciao.
Ciao.